Welcome, everyone, to the School of Visual Arts. It's nice to see you all. Thank you for coming tonight. Ed White will not be here. I suspect that quite a few of you know that. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to. Unfortunately, he's quite ill. However, we do have Philip Gefter this evening. And by way of introduction, please allow me to introduce Philip. Philip was on the staff at the New York Times for over 15 years, most notably as the page one picture editor. As you probably know, he writes about photography for Aperture, Dear Dave magazine, The Daily Beast, and other publications. His essays are collected in the book Photography After Frank, which was published by Aperture in 2009. In 2011, he and Richard Press released a feature-length documentary entitled Bill Cunningham, New York, about the New York Times photographer Bill Cunningham. In that same year, Gefter received a museum scholar residency at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles to work on the book, his biography of Sam Wagstaff, Wagstaff Before and After Mapplethorpe, which we gather and celebrate this evening. So without any further ado, please welcome Philip Gefter, and take note that there will be some copies of the book available for sale in the lobby, and they will be signed.
Yes, I will sign them.
Yes, let's give Philip a hand.
That's yours. No, that's fine.
Want to say it again?
No. Thank you, Stephen. I didn't recognize that person you just introduced. Thank you for School of Visual Arts and the beloved Dear Dave magazine for having me here tonight. And I just want to say, Ed White, I think, is still in the hospital, and I wish him a speedy and painless recovery. I just wanted to say that out loud. So I'm going to, instead of being a dialogue with all of you, I'm going to be in a kind of monologue. I'm talking about Sam Wagstaff, Robert Mapplethorpe, and the gay sensibility. So, did you know that photography and homosexuality share something in common? Let's say it's a coincidence of timing. In the early 1970s, growing respect for photography in the art world occurred simultaneously with the growing visibility of the gay rights movement. Sam Wagstaff, on the left, was instrumental in elevating the status of photography to an art world equal. And Robert Mapplethorpe, on the right, brought homoerotic representation in photographic imagery to the museum and gallery wall. Before Wagstaff started collecting photographs, photography was still considered not much more than a utilitarian medium, an applied art, a bastard of the arts. And while Mapplethorpe was not the first to photograph the male nude in homoerotic terms, there was, after all, Thomas Eakins in the 19th century, Baron von Gluden and F. Holland Day at the turn of the 20th century, and George Platt Lynes in the mid-20th century. Mapplethorpe, though, with the help of Wagstaff, was a pioneer in convincing galleries to show his work. Wagstaff and Mapplethorpe were at the intersection of photography and the gay sensibility. How many of you have ever heard of Sam Wagstaff before today? Wow, well, this is a very sophisticated audience. Sam Wagstaff was known most conspicuously as the lover, mentor, and patron of Robert Mapplethorpe, but it turns out that that was only one of Wagstaff's distinctions. In fact, Sam Wagstaff was a much more influential figure in shaping art history in the last half of the 20th century and in elevating photography to an equal in the art world than is widely understood. But his legacy has gotten lost in the glare of Mapplethorpe's notoriety. So I would like to introduce you to Sam Wagstaff, again, on the left, and Robert Mapplethorpe, on the right, a legendary couple of the 20th century, not only because they were sexy, not only because they were glamorous, and not only because they were gay. Together, and individually, Wagstaff and Mapplethorpe had an enormous impact on the field of photography. Wagstaff was a tireless advocate for photography's legitimacy as a medium of artistic expression and experimentation. And he was very convincing because of his gold-plated credentials, his social connections, and ultimately his crowning achievement, his photography collection, one of the earliest, which he would sell to the Getty Museum in 1984 for $5 million, which is more than 11 million in today's dollars. The Wagstaff collection helped launch the Getty Museum's collection of photographs, now regarded among the finest museum collections in the world. Often, Wagstaff's activities and influence paralleled that of John Tchaikovsky, the great champion of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, despite the fact that Wagstaff did not have the institutional platform. Judy Keller, senior curator of photography at the Getty, considers the Wagstaff collection the core of the museum's holdings in photographs. Not only because it is one of the largest, she said, it has the greatest range in terms of the history it covers. Mapplethorpe was a pioneer with an explosive subject, that of the male nude, showing male genitalia in detail, and also in his representation of S&M sex. The controversies surrounding his work only propelled his reputation, but the quality, substance, and originality of his photographs secured his place in art history. Photography and homosexuality both rose from the margins of legitimacy. Each suffered a gauntlet of prejudice during their coming of age. In the early 1970s, for example, to be openly gay was still very much a cultural taboo. The rise of gay rights in America was a reaction to this prejudice, and it followed a rapid trajectory that began with the civil rights movement in the early 1960s, then feminism later in that decade, and of course the entire sexual revolution. The sexual revolution was a great cover in those days for bisexual experimentation. And if you'll excuse this stretch of a comparison, and it is a stretch, bisexuality was tolerated in those days in the same way that photography was tolerated in pop art and conceptual art in the 1960s. Photography, too, had to creep its way to legitimacy. Throughout the 1960s, the photographic image was hiding in plain sight in canvases on the walls of museums and galleries, in works by Warhol and Rauschenberg, John Baldessari, and Andrew Shea. They all used photographs, but in service of their larger conceptual ideas. Here, Andy Warhol's Race Riot, 1964. He made 10 silkscreen canvases of this one picture, which was originally published in a 1963 Life magazine spread about the civil rights protests in Montgomery, Alabama. Andy Warhol and Sam Wagstaff were friends, and Andy gave Sam 2 of these silkscreened canvases in red. Several years later, Sam bought 2 others in white and blue from Leo Castelli, Warhol's dealer, for a whopping $768. Sam put this grid together, called Race Riot, and kept it his entire life. The work has since been owned by several other art collectors, and then sold earlier this year at Christie's for a whopping $62.8 million. Anyway, you see that this work on canvas is photo-based, its visual language representational, its articulation purely photographic. But no one deemed it photography. It's a silkscreen on canvas, the kind of conceptual work being done in the 60s that was conditioning an art-going public to the language of the photograph, even as the photograph itself, on its own, was still considered nothing more than a graphic art. In December 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality from its list of psychiatric disorders. This made front-page headlines across the country. It was 4 years after Stonewall, the symbolic beginning of gay liberation in America. It was a big deal that homosexuality was no longer psychiatrically pathologized, and for gay people, the veil of fear about being discovered, much less arrested, was beginning to lift. Dwayne Michaels, who made this piece, was gay, 41 years old in 1973, and had lived through his 20s and 30s when homosexuality was still one of the worst cultural taboos. It's worth noting that as late as 1963, the New York Times regularly used the word pervert for homosexual. Michaels would make many narrative pieces about the tyranny of the love that dare not speak its name. This one is called The Unfortunate Man. This is what Michaels writes under the image, which of course you can read, but the unfortunate man could not touch the one he loved. It had been declared illegal by the law. Slowly his fingers became toes and his hands gradually became feet. He began to wear shoes on his hands to disguise his pain. It never occurred to him to break the law. The homosexual closet had been a roomy place in the New York art world of the 1950s and 60s, where artists like Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, Jasper Johns, Ellsworth Kelly, Andy Warhol, and others resided. Still, the majority of gay men and lesbians throughout the country were painfully isolated, constantly fearful of being found out, and had to obsessively protect their own secret, a revelation certain to destroy their lives if it were discovered. Sam Wagstaff, seen here almost 10 years before he met Mapplethorpe, spent the 1960s living a double life in the roomy art world closet of Manhattan. He maintained a heterosexual persona as a curator of painting and sculpture at the Wadsworth Atheneum, and later as a curator of contemporary art at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Photography then was still considered a bastard child of the arts, and Wagstaff himself, who, by the way, organized the very first museum show of minimal art in 1964, called Black, White, and Gray, he too would often give voice to the art world prejudice against photography. Painting is art and photography is not art 99% of the time, Wagstaff told the Hartford Times in 1961. At the time, that was the general consensus of curators, critics, and artists themselves. Here's a picture of Robert Mapplethorpe taken by Gerard Malanga in the early 1970s. Mapplethorpe had gone to a preeminent art school, Pratt Institute, and was getting his cultural education at the Chelsea Hotel and Max's Kansas City, hanging out with the Warhol posse, Candy Darling, Harley Woodlawn, and other inhabitants of the notorious back room. Their flamboyance attracted plenty of media attention, and I believe inadvertently paved the way for what would become the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and much later transgender community. The seductive, sexually atmospheric tone of the song A Walk on the Wild Side, written by Lou Reed about this group in the back room at Max's, perfectly sums up the persona Mapplethorpe was cultivating there too. A Walk on the Wild Side. It was during this period that David Hockney would make a drawing of Robert Mapplethorpe, which he gave to him in friendship, an example of how quickly Mapplethorpe landed in the center of the art world ethos of New York, barely in his early 20s. In 1972, Sam Wagstaff, 50 years old, met Robert Mapplethorpe, who was half his age, and they fell in love. This picture was taken not long after they became lovers. Mapplethorpe was already very free and open about his attraction to men. Sam really respected the way I was honest about being gay, Robert told his biographer. I helped Sam to be more open about his sexuality. At the same time, it was at Mapplethorpe's urging that Wagstaff first turned his art historical eye to photography. In January 1973, at an exhibition Sam and Robert both attended at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Sam had his aha moment when he saw this photograph of the Flatiron Building by Edward Steichen. The Flatiron Building was considered radical at the time of its construction in 1902 because of its shape, its broad Beaux-Arts facade narrowing to a fine triangular point at the fork in two thoroughfares, Fifth Avenue and Broadway. The photograph of the Flatiron might be considered an equally bold piece of work, a stark and beautiful urban study in lusty shades of black and gray, the branches of the trees in the foreground fashioning a delicate calligraphy against the solid, monumental geometry of the building behind it. It's one of the finest examples of pictorialism, a movement at the turn of the 20th century in which photographic art-making drifted from the optical precision that rendered objects true to life toward a more painterly, interpretive resolution. For Wagstaff, the Flatiron looked neither like a photograph nor a drawing, floating in the visual ether as an invention all its own. It was the first photograph in which Sam recognized and acknowledged the subject and the image to be inextricable and of equal weight. For him, it was a visual construction in which shape and tone and light and space and juxtaposition all danced on the surface of a single piece of paper, nothing less than a perfect alchemy of emotion, perception, and form. Very soon after seeing that show, Wagstaff set out on a single-minded mission to acquire photographs, long before anyone else thought they had any value. Wagstaff would later tell people that Robert got me into photography, but not before Mapplethorpe asked Patti Smith, his ex-girlfriend, not yet the major rock star she would become, to do a tarot card reading to see if collecting photographs was an auspicious venture for Sam. Wagstaff would later wryly tell people, "I began to collect photographs with Patti Smith's approval." In the early 1970s in New York City, when gay rights had become a political issue, gay men became more open about their sexuality and more visibly identifiable on the streets. Wagstaff and Mapplethorpe could walk through downtown Manhattan as it crackled with a new erotic charge. Here, a picture by Peter Hujar, Mapplethorpe's contemporary, in downtown Manhattan. The gay male gaze had been liberated and was never freer to roam in plain sight, a glance caught over the shoulder, a smile of recognition between strangers, instant hookups right there on the street. In those freewheeling years before AIDS, the joke among gay men in New York was that sex between strangers was merely a howdy-do. At the same time, in the early 1970s, photography too was in the air. Because of the not-so-subliminal conditioning to the photographic image in the works of Warhol, Rauschenberg, etc., throughout the 1960s, art schools had begun to establish their own programs of photography within a fine arts curriculum. Two commercial photography galleries had opened in New York, and in 1972, the Diane Arbus retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art was like a coming-out party for photography in the art world, the first time art critics considered the medium in art world terms. Wagstaff was picking up on all of this when he first turned to photography in 1973, even though his own art world colleagues thought he was crazy. They considered it beneath him. This only amused him. Their prejudices would fuel his public advocacy about the medium's importance. Here's what Sam Wagstaff told the Washington Post in that period. Gustave Le Gray made pictures in the 1850s. He's the greatest photographer of all, the best that there has been, and the textbooks hardly mention him. It's like leaving Rembrandt out of a history of Western art. In 1972, Mapplethorpe had not yet even claimed photography as his medium. He was still making collages and assemblages with found photographs from physique magazines and Polaroid self-portraits, often naked, like this one he made for the cover of a magazine called Gay Power in 1970. When Wagstaff, who had been a museum curator and had the best art historical training, saw Mapplethorpe's work for the first time, he thought the assemblages and collages were in keeping with the conceptual work being done in that period. But he responded to something in the work that was completely new, the homoerotic component. Mapplethorpe was incorporating the nude self-portraits he made with a Polaroid camera into his assemblages, here appearing almost defiantly naked. Mapplethorpe would make this diptych of himself and Sam having sex not long after they met. I like to think of this diptych as documentation of what would become a marriage of significant homosexual influence in the world of photography. By 1973, Wagstaff not only began collecting photographs, but also set Robert up with a studio and a camera. Robert went with Sam when he first started buying photographs, at auction as well as at flea markets. And within 4 years, by 1976, Wagstaff, this man on his knees between the legs of his lover, would be sitting on very proper photography committees at the Museum of Modern Art and the Metropolitan Museum, appearing on panels, loaning works from his collection to museum shows, writing articles about photography, and being written about in mainstream magazines. Because of his own pedigree in the art world and his patrician background, with degrees from Yale and the Venerable Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, his collecting started to change curatorial and critical opinion about this second-class medium. For example, in 1974, Sam caused ripples across the Atlantic when he purchased at auction an album of photographs by the then unknown Julia Margaret Cameron for $130,000, a staggering sum to pay for photographs at the time. It was reported in all the London papers. It was called the Herschel album because Cameron assembled the 95 prints in a fine leather-bound album as a gift for her friend, John Herschel, the 19th century astronomer and inventor. Today, the current record price of a single print by Cameron at auction is $250,000. The Herschel album today would be worth at least several million. It was not until 1977 that Sotheby's Park Bernay in New York established its own autonomous photography department. Until then, not enough material emerged to justify regularly scheduled photography auctions. Anne Horton, the head of that new department then, cited Wagstaff's acquisitions in Europe as incentive for them to hold regular photography auctions in New York. Horton admired Wagstaff's aesthetic judgment and confidence, but also his breeding, which seemed to her anomalous in the context of photography. Here's what she said about him. Sam had personality and style. Once he even wrote me a little note thanking me for doing the Baron de Meyer sale. It was wonderful, and I was so amazed. He must have picked those manners up in boarding school. I was so proud to have him in my field. Wagstaff himself began experimenting with photography as he got interested in collecting it. Shown here a series of his self-portraits, circa 1973. It looks to me as if he were documenting his newly felt liberation as an uncloseted gay man, as if he were an adolescent experimenting with looking sexy. Mapplethorpe, too, had been making self-portraits with the Polaroid camera, and when Robert started doing serious photographic work, he made this self-portrait with whip, one of his iconic pictures from that decade. Maybe he was representing himself as the devil in the eyes of a world hostile to gay people, or highlighting the anus as an erotic focal point. Whether Mapplethorpe meant it this way or not, though, my take is that it's an unapologetic and, excuse the term, fuck you counterpoint to the same kind of prejudice that had brought Dwayne Michaels to make The Unfortunate Man. In Wagstaff's exploration of photography, the penis was a visual preoccupation in the period of his new out-of-the-closet freedom in 1973. Here, a tricolor grid Sam made of his own crotch in bathing suits. Somehow, the grid was of interest to him, as in Warhol's Race Riot, which Sam had turned into a grid in keeping with Warhol's own repetition of images. Mapplethorpe, too, would focus more directly on male genitalia in his work, his own and others. This was the invitation to Mapplethorpe's first show in 1973, an exhibit of his Polaroids in the back room of Light Gallery. This hide-and-seek crotch shot is the beginning of many pictures he would make of the penis as an object of desire, as in this alluring picture of jockstrap-draped male genitalia. Or here, a picture called Mr. 10½, the genitals of the porn star Mark Stevens, presented almost forensically as a slab of beef or sausage. People don't often talk about the wit of Robert Mapplethorpe, but I think the humor in his pictures is a subject worthy of someone's doctoral dissertation. Take note. Here, too, another example of Mapplethorpe's wit, Man in Polyester Suit, made in 1980. I have always said that the man in this picture could walk into any boardroom in America exposed like this and immediately assume the power. Mapplethorpe said that this model, Milton Moore, with whom he was involved for a while, possessed his ideal erection. In the period when gay liberation took hold, other photographers, too, foregrounded the penis as an object of contemplation and desire. In the mid-1970s, Peter Hujar made this picture of a friend of his, another iconic image of the era, shocking many people then because nobody had really photographed the erection in such formal terms. The brilliance of this photograph is that the subject observes his own endowment with the same contemplation or surprise as the viewer. Arthur Tress was another photographer of the period to explore homosexual desire, here depicting with some irony the symbolism of the power of the penis, as if the erection turned man into Superman, at least in his own mind. And yet, in the mid-1970s, these photographers still remained at the margins of the photography world. The museums were focusing on street photography, or the snapshot aesthetic, or new color work by Stephen Shore and William Eggleston. Curators did not yet take this homoerotically infused imagery seriously, despite the fact that it was representing a subculture that was becoming ever more influential in society and in photography. In 1977, Mapplethorpe's first major gallery show was divided into the X pictures, his homoerotic and S&M images, at an art space called The Kitchen, and the Y pictures, his portraits mostly, at Holly Solomon Gallery. Even though Sam had nothing to do with Robert's introduction to Holly Solomon, he would play a significant role in her decision to give him a show. Sam Wagstaff was considered a great photography collector, Holly Solomon said. I wouldn't have touched Robert without Sam, and there were others like me who felt the same way. That said, Germano Chalant, who would later become a curator at the Guggenheim, understood what a very powerful gesture it was for Mapplethorpe to come out in his erotic photographs, not only as a person, but an artist. Mapplethorpe definitely collected pornography, Chalant said, but these images were a completely different input in the art world, as works of art, and that is what makes his work so radical. Mapplethorpe paved the way for the legitimacy of male nudity in photography, and others would follow his lead. Today, the disrobing of the male body is ubiquitous in advertising, and of course in selfies and sexting. But Mapplethorpe was the first to convince the galleries to show his work and expose to the public the unrobed and often eroticized male form. It's for this reason I focus on Mapplethorpe as a seminal force in making visible and respectable, and okay, even saleable, a body of photographic work that explored homoerotic desire in classical terms. This picture you've been looking at, made in 1986, exemplifies Mapplethorpe's aestheticization of male genitalia. A penis, like a stamen of a flower, which he also would photograph, is a reproductive organ. I like to think of flowers as the earth's nerve endings. Mapplethorpe seemed to sexualize flowers as much as he did the male body, but equally he aestheticized them. My approach to photographing a flower is not much different than photographing a cock, Robert told Germano Chalant. Basically, it's the same thing. It's about lighting and composition. What makes Mapplethorpe's work important in art historical terms is the way he rendered homoerotic desire with such formal resolution, with such elegance and cool minimalism, the male form mostly as sculptural, the paraphernalia of S&M considered with as much detail as the men themselves. Mapplethorpe used to say that he thought of S&M as sex and magic. Meanwhile, Sam Wagstaff, too, was a seminal figure, certainly in Mapplethorpe's life and career, but equally because of his broader influence on the field of photography itself. By 1978, Wagstaff had become instrumental in establishing the international art market for photography. He's seen here in the mid-1970s in his apartment, his very cool apartment on the top of 1/5 Avenue. His activities in the auction rooms of London and New York attracted other collectors whose names are not known outside of that world, but who also were gay. Paul Walter, John Waddell, Pierre Eproxine, George Rinhart, and others. My overarching point here is that gay men led the public charge for photography in the art market with their newly liberated sensibilities and willing, unfettered gay male gazes. Here, Sam at a photography auction in the mid-1980s. These gay collectors were all high-minded and influential in garnering respect for photography in the loftiest curatorial circles. In 1984, Wagstaff's collection, as I said before, was acquired by the J. Paul Getty Museum. Both John Waddell's collection and Howard Gilman's collections were respectively acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the Museum of Modern Art acquired a good portion of Paul Walter's collection. These constitute not only collections of photographs representing the best of the medium, but also, I submit, the gay sensibility of the collectors as they shaped and recast what was important in the history of photography. Wagstaff managed to become a ringleader for this small and select group of highly aestheticized gay men who saw a cultural opening and, like all pioneers, charged through it. By the time they were finished, their photography collections composed an entire visual record at its finest of the 19th and 20th centuries, resulting in a substantial treasure of photographic excellence. It was with pleasure, as well as their foresight, connoisseurship, and regard for a civilized society, that they left what was once considered a marginal form safely in the hands of the nation's most august art institutions, where it will be studied and enjoyed and argued over in perpetuity. In 1978, an exhibition called The Male Nude, A Survey in Photography, opened at the Marcuse Pfeiffer Gallery in New York. Shown were over 75 photographers throughout the history of photography. Marcuse Pfeiffer later wrote that of all the fascinating things she learned while putting this exhibition together, the most conspicuous is that the subject of the male nude is still considered a controversial one, even if we believe that this particular decade is more liberal, liberated, libertine. That was in 1978. The male body was displayed for direct visual contemplation, the penis rarely before seen with such photographic clarity on the walls of a proper gallery. But surely that can't be the explanation for so many reviewers to claim that the show was homosexual themed. Here's what Gene Thornton wrote in his review in the New York Times. There is something disconcerting about the sight of a man's naked body being presented primarily as a sexual object. Of course, I don't agree with Mr. Thornton. The male nude photograph had pushed its way onto the walls of galleries and museums from the gay community. Artists like Mapplethorpe, Peter Hujar, Duane Michaels, and others in the 1970s. And of course, those influential collectors and champions of the medium like Sam Wagstaff and his cohort, who pointed out the art historical significance of von Gluten, F. Hollanday, and George Platt Lynes, among other earlier photographers who photographed the male nude. Today, it is not disconcerting to view the sight of a man's naked body and simply observe it, whether in sexual terms or classical terms, as it was to critics in 1978. This picture, by the way, was not in the male nude show. Sam Wagstaff made this picture in 1973 during his experimental period with making photographs. Because he had studied art history and had been a curator of painting and sculpture, he would have known this drawing by Leonardo, Vitruvian Man, an attempt to understand human proportion. A decade later, Mapplethorpe would make this picture, striking in similarity to Wagstaff's own Vitruvian Man. I show you these together not to suggest that Mapplethorpe took the idea from Wagstaff, but evident in Sam's own experimentation with photography is a template for what might be seen as signatures of Robert Mapplethorpe's work. Their respective Vitruvian men call attention to the visual dialogue between the two photographs, and ultimately to the relationship between Wagstaff and Mapplethorpe as patron and artist, which was also, by the way, a lover's discourse. This dialogue underscored the growing interest in photography as a fine art. This dialogue underscored the growing interest in photography as a fine art in the early 1970s at the precise moment when new sexual freedoms brought about the gay rights movement. Today, of course, Mapplethorpe's reputation is mythic. Peter Hujar is finally gaining the recognition he deserves. And in my judgment, it's about time for the major Duane Michaels Museum retrospective that opened last month at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Think of them as artists of an era who brought attention and regard to the representation of homoerotic desire. And think of those men whose fine photography collections are now in the hands of the great museums. Most of them were gay. However you define the gay sensibility, its influence in cultural terms, never mind photography, is major. Thank you. I'm sorry that wasn't more conversational in tone, but there are microphones on either side if anyone has questions, and maybe you'd like to raise the lights. That would be great. I think Robert sort of had a sense of art history, or the history of photography anyway, by the time he met Sam. A year before he met Sam, he had been involved with John McKendry, who was a curator of prints and photographs at the Metropolitan Museum. And John would invite Robert up to the Met to look at photographs. So Robert had already begun to be exposed to photographs, mostly 19th century photographs. I think Sam, and I don't know this, I don't have actual documentation, but Sam did the first museum show of minimal art, and I think that whatever conversations they had between them, as Robert was beginning to turn solely to photography, would have included a certain kind of distilled vision that I think is one of his signatures. I think so. I mean, I don't think anyone else has ever said that or, written that, but I think so, definitely. George Platt Lyons photographed in the 30s and 40s mostly. He died in 1955, I think, if that's right. And he was actually a very successful commercial photographer for Vogue and made portraits and all of that. But he did any number of series of homoerotic tableau, let's say, that sort of mythic tableau in which he'd have one or two or three men in various poses that were male nudes in various poses that were kind of mythical figures. Beautifully lit, gorgeous photographs. And you can see a direct relationship visually from George Platt Lyons to Robert Mapplethorpe, even though Robert did not photograph men, necessarily in these mythic tableaux, but you can see the articulation of the male form is very similar to what George Platt Lyons was doing. There's an interesting story in my book about Sam in the early 1950s had a year-long relationship with a man named Chuck Howard who had been George Platt Lyons' lover. So soon after Sam met Robert in 1972, maybe 3 years later, Sam took Robert up to Connecticut to visit a man named Bernard Perlin, who had been George Platt Lyons' friend for many, many years, and who had inherited all of George Platt Lyons' photographs and negatives. And Sam and Robert spent the afternoon by themselves in the barn where they were kept, looking at these pictures. Sam put aside maybe a dozen of them, but Bernard Perlin told me he never came back to get them. And Sam often dismissed George Platt Lyons' work in the 70s, which leads me to believe that he and Robert were sort of studying them, but then erasing the connection. That's my conclusion. I also think that Sam was secretly looking for pictures of Chuck Howard, but anyway. I think that yeah. Well, I think the heterosexual aesthetic defined photography for since its inception, and I think this has come along and I don't know, just sort of informed it, expanded it, altered it. Well, I mean, it's a subtle thing, and I don't want to say that you can look at like that Sam or Paul Walter or anyone else were collecting gay photographs necessarily, but I think you can see in their choices, which often overlapped with the canon, but equally departed from the canon. A kind of a vision that was original, somewhat alternative. And I think the alternative is key. I think, I mean, we could talk about what forms the gay sensibility, and I think it goes back to alienation in society. And so Sam, for example, I mean, this is sort of an example of what I mean by his gay sensibility, how you can see it in his collection. He was a very serious collector, but he was also a serial collector. So before he even started collecting photographs, he was collecting like Dogon African sculpture, and then Native American mimbre pots. That's how you pronounce it. And then after photography, silver, American silver. Each of them was a kind of underappreciated form or medium, and he, I think, whether consciously or not, set out to resuscitate or bring to the attention of culture these objects, and saying, like, wait a minute, look at this. This is much more important and interesting than you have given attention to. And maybe there's something here that you're not seeing. Maybe there's some magic or some truer sense of our being in these objects. And he brought that same approach to photography. And I think when I talk about the gay sensibility, that's kind of what I am getting at. So you can look at any of their collections and, one wouldn't necessarily say, oh, a gay man put this together. But once you realize that, it's a gay man who, may have lived a very heterosexual persona, had a heterosexual persona, was pointing to this or this or this or that or that. It was his sensibility, identifying something that most of society overlooked. And I think that's what I mean by, photography itself. When you think about Sam turning to photography before, there were like 3 collectors maybe, and they were doing it very quietly. But Sam and each of these guys started collecting photographs in the 70s before anybody took it seriously. They were saying, look at this. This is more important than you think. And, yes, John Tchaikovsky was heterosexual, and yes, there were a lot of, macho guys, Lee Friedlander and Gary Winogrand and Robert Frank and all these people making photographs, but that was not what interested Sam and Paul Walter and these other guys. So the Kinsey Institute I think they might have known about it, but I actually have no documentation of their going to visit it. Right. I think that's true. As I said, they may have, I just don't have any documentation of it. But also the Kinsey collection, I think, was smaller than it has become. I think, its mandate was to start collecting more and more and more homoerotic imagery later. But I don't know that for a fact. Well, it's actually a very good question. He did a body of work in particular of Lisa Lyon. I think that those are inferior. That is an inferior body of work in Robert's larger body of work. It's not because Lisa is a woman per se, although the way that he was photographing her, as the female nude, actually female nude bodybuilder. There's an artifice to those photographs. He actually they constructed these kind of, fictional representations of ideas that they actually don't seem true to what Robert was about as an artist. And also, if you look at those pictures versus his pictures of Patti Smith, those pictures are electric. Those pictures of he and Patti Smith. There's a quote by Rene Ricard. It's something like, a photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe is beautiful, but a photograph of Patti Smith by Robert Mapplethorpe is history. And he said that early on in '77 or something. I don't know that answers your question, but I think that a lot of his, female nude imagery, which is a small body of his work, is not quite. It seems fake to me. But I probably just lost somebody millions of dollars who own all these Lisa Lyons pictures. Sam, well, it's a very good question. It's a very complicated one, and I'm just trying to think of how quickly I can, or just how efficiently I can describe this. When Sam did the Black, White, and Gray show, the first minimal show, he wrote about John Cage being a presiding influence over that new young generation of artists. And John Cage's work is all about, John Cage's work addresses the consciousness of being. And what it's intended to do, at least on some level, is to bring the viewer or the listener back to their own senses, literally, back to their awareness of themselves and their senses. So John Cage did this, very well-known symphony called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. I don't know how many of you are aware of it. It consists of someone arriving on stage, sitting down at a piano, and doing nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The idea, when it was first presented in Woodstock in 1952, people sort of got up and walked, like stormed out. They thought it was an indignation. And John Cage just kind of shrugged and said, they don't understand. They don't know that if they actually heard what was going on, there were birds singing outside and raindrops dropping and, people rustling papers, and that's what was going on all around them. And so it was really about paying attention to your experience. Sam was very aware of that. Sam, I think his eyes informed him more than perhaps even other senses. And so for him to look, to stare at something, was to take it in and to understand the world that way. When he turned to photography, he understood. I think what he responded to initially, he was more interested in the 19th century initially, and I think a lot of his collection is more 19th century than 20th century. Imagine what it was like when photography was invented, and all of a sudden you could see like what the world looked like on this piece of paper. It was magical. It was an amazing thing. The photographed world was just kind of, oh my God, it's like, I always refer to like the iPhone. The first time you did this with an iPhone, that was like, holy fuck, And I think Sam was aware of that magic, like the fact of the photographed world in the 19th century was magical to him. And he could get lost, he could let his eye roam and like kind of look around a photographic image and sort of try to understand what people then kind of how they responded to that. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense, but there's something about that. I agree with that. That's not to say that Robert wasn't enormously talented and wouldn't have become an artist in his own right, but he certainly had a leg up with Sam. Sam recognized very early on, and because of his various pedigrees, was able to just, help Robert become mythic. Yes, absolutely. And Robert's too. I mean, they both had courage. I mean, there was a great deal of resistance to Mapplethorpe's work, as I'm sure some of you know. And he really was, they really were courageous. I mean, Sam too, he stood up to a lot of people. I think she was afraid. I think she was, she had her doubts about photography to begin with. It was a risk for her to even show photographs in 1977. That may be, but I mean, I've heard her in documentaries talk about her resistance to photography even as late as 1977, and she didn't know if it was a good career move, a good gallery move. It took her a year to agree to give Robert a show. So, and then she was very unwilling to show the homoerotic work just because it was too loaded at the time. So, that's it. Okay. I'm happy to sign books outside. Thank you. Thanks very much.